Test, test, test. All right, good evening, guys. Hopefully your weekend has gone well. We just got back from Missouri just a little bit ago, and so it's nice to be back home. We did a side trip to Chicago to see Hamilton, so if you are any of my Hamilton kids and you want to discuss the musical now that I've seen it for the first time, I would be happy to talk to you about anything. It's pretty awesome if you get a chance, especially if you win the lottery, to be able to go check that out. I would encourage you to do so. We've got a number of questions tonight. A lot of them from the four periods are fairly closely related, so I don't think the review session is going to take us very long. But hopefully we answer your questions, and if we don't, feel free to send an email either during or after, and I'll be able to reply to you personally if you don't feel like you get your answers taken care of here. So I'm going to start off with period 5 questions first and then work my way through the other sections. Feel free to add questions to the comment board, and after I do a pass through, I'll double check to make sure that I've got everybody covered. So starting with period 5, I've got a question asking about the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. So the easiest way to think about that topic, if you take the John Adams presidency and we're afraid of a war with France, we have the XYZ affair that is convincing Americans that the French are not being kind to us, that they have insulted us, they are harassing our ships at sea, and so we start building up our military to defend against the French. At least that's what they officially say. But Hamilton is the leader of that military, and he's got ideas about possibly using the military to also squash Democratic Republicans, especially if what's been happening in France might start happening here with the guillotine and reign of terror and that sort of stuff. So we've got really heightened tensions and paranoia about what a potential French invasion might look like, especially if Jefferson and Madison are traitorous in their behaviors. So the Alien and Sedition Act was an attempt to try to make it difficult for immigrants to become naturalized citizens because they would typically vote for Democratic Republicans. It gave the president the opportunity to reject immigrants out of hand. It also gave the government the chance to lock anybody up who was saying negative things about the government. So there's a lot of elements of the Bill of Rights that are being threatened by what's taking place. And so the question that was asked was about, first of all, the XYZ affair. And the XYZ affair is strictly with the changing of the guard as far as leaders in France, and the fact that we were slowly paying back our debts, but not doing so at the speed that they would prefer. there were a group of people in France who demanded a bribe from our ambassadors before we could talk to the leaders in France. The three people who demanded bribes were known as the code names X, Y, and Z, and that's where the XYZ affair came from. That was the insult that set off the Americans. After the Alien and Sedition Acts, though, the question that was asked was what was going on with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And for the purposes of our course, it's not going to be important that you could differentiate the two of them. You want to understand them in combination. They're being written by Jefferson and Madison during a time where they feel like the federal government under Hamilton and the Federalists has now gotten too big. They've used the Elastic Clause to make the Bank of the United States. They've now created this horrible Alien and Sedition Act. They've now cracked down the farmers with the Whiskey Rebellion. And so Jefferson and Madison come out with these statements. And in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, they each write a document. And in their documents, they make these two claims. Number one, if the United States government creates a law that is unconstitutional, like the Alien and Sedition Acts, their argument was it wasn't the federal government's job to alone figure out if it's constitutional. It's up to the states, since they're the ones who agreed to the Constitution. And so in their mind, it was the duty of the states to defend the people when the United States government, started acting in an unconstitutional way. The second element, and this is going to be the much more important element on top of just states' rights, is the idea that they were arguing for nullification, the idea that if there's an unconstitutional law, the states should be able to ignore that law and make it invalid if it doesn't square with the Constitution. Now, what you're going to see in Chapter 11 is we're going to adopt a very different viewpoint, and the viewpoint we're going to pick up is that the Supreme Court should have that job, and we're going to see that at the beginning of Chapter 11. The problem with Jefferson and Madison is their arguments are so strong for states' rights that eventually Southern states will start using their arguments to explain why they should fight back against the United States government to protect slavery and why they should eventually secede. So while Jefferson and Madison weren't looking at it as going that far to secession and Civil War, eventually the Southerners are really going to latch onto their arguments as a way to fight back against the United States when they feel like it's going too far. The next question I see, what was the Constitutional Convention? The one that we discussed in Chapter 10 was the one that was held after Annapolis. So you had Shays' Rebellion. You then had the Annapolis Convention that was getting together to talk about could we fix the Articles of Confederation. And then we held a Constitutional Convention to determine what our new government would look like. And at that meeting, they quickly realized that the Articles couldn't be fixed and they needed something different. Let me see here. The next question, can I explain the Land Ordinance and the Northwest Ordinances? And so I'm going to use the textbook map because it does it the best for being able to identify what is going on with these two laws that are being created. So inside your textbook, you'll find this map right here. This is your Land Ordinance of 1785, where they determined that up in the Northwest Territory, they would set up a grid system for what would be happening with the differentiation of land out west. And so it's carving up land into parcels or chunks, setting aside a section for public schools to be put in place eventually. And then the Northwest Ordinance is the one that is going to determine in this whole area what's going on with how many people you need to become a territory, how many people you need to become a state. But then they also make the assertion that slavery is not going to be permitted there because the central government says so. And it's this precedent that's being set down is weird because the Articles are so weak, but they take a very definite stance in this area that slavery is not going to be permitted, which becomes a legacy item that we're going to see moving towards the Civil War, where the North will then hold this as a rationale for why they can get involved in abolishing slavery, even in states where it's already been established. And so that's where a battle for the Civil War is coming in from as well. So what you should be noticing from this chapter is with Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, with the Northwest Ordinance, you've got a number of different Civil War battles that we as historians realize took place well before the Civil War took place. And they were the seeds that were planted that created this sectional division between North and South. The next question, why did the Articles of Confederation not work as a government, so they had to create a new constitution? We did our simulation in class that many of you guys either had a chance to do or else watch through the video link, where we discovered that by having a very weak central government that gave the power to the states and didn't give the government the power to regulate the economy or to charge taxes or to maintain a military force, we had economic problems, we weren't repaying our debts, and we had enemies with the Spanish, the French, and the British, and Native Americans who were threatening the Americas on all different sides. And then also we had problems internally where the government was malfunctioning so badly that we had freedom, but we had people like Daniel Shays who are leading rebellions because of the fact that the economy is falling apart and they're losing their farms as a result of this dysfunction. So with the Articles, there's a bunch of different issues that are popping up that most of the Founding Fathers realized could be dealt with a stronger central government that could then more efficiently deal with the problems that we need to deal with. Let me see here. The next question is, what was the Society of the Cincinnati? It's a more trivial point that's being used to explain to you that as Americans, we don't really like, as middle class type mentality people, the idea of elitism, and it's looked down upon from the very beginnings. Not that people can't be elite, but when they flaunt that and when they try to create, in this case, a private club of former military officers that are meeting in what's called the Society of the Cincinnati so they could hold secret meetings and discuss with one another. And there's a feeling of suspicion that perhaps these individuals might be up to no good by meeting behind closed doors with just the elites. And there are many people who think that that's not a good look for Americans, where we're trying to move against the idea of elitism based on title or background or family name or whatever. And so that's what they're trying to communicate with that piece of the textbook. It's fairly trivial, but it's meant to be an example to show you what that looks like during the time period. So let me check here with period 5. I think I just exhausted the questions for period 5. And so I'm going to move to period 2's questions now. Let me see here. The first question is about Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays' Rebellion is really simple. At the end of the Articles of Confederation, we had a guy named Daniel Shays, who was a former soldier during the American Revolution, still armed, still possessing military tactics and techniques, still a leader. And because of the fact that the central government was not honoring its debts and its financial system was a mess, and the bankers in the state wanting to get paid for the money that he owed for his land that he could not repay because of his time in the military, and because the state was willing to side with the bankers of the state rather than with him as a former soldier, he was about to lose his farm, even though he was one of the soldiers who helped win the American Revolution. A bunch of other farmers in the area were in the same situation, so he just rounded them all up and convinced them to attack the tax collectors and the central political officers and business owners in that area of Massachusetts. In a style that was very reminiscent to what you saw with Bacon's Rebellion. And that was very much trying to highlight for you that throughout history, we have seen a rebellious instinct in Americans. When they feel like they're being persecuted, they have no problems resorting to violence during this time period to rally a mob and go attack. And we saw that take place during the Revolution anyways. And so there's a feeling that these Massachusetts farmers have, that perhaps their enemy is now the central government that's worthless and doing nothing to help them. The other question that's there is about the idea of Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood is just a concept of what a good woman will be doing during this time period to help out the creation of this new country and this new government. And so the idea of Republican motherhood was the idea that men and women have roles inside the family, but they're very much blurred because 90+% of people are farming. And in farm families, men and women are typically working side by side with kids to all work the farm. But with these families, they're going to have traditional conceptions of what they view as being men's jobs and women's jobs, especially when it comes to support of the revolution. And so for Republican motherhood, this was the idea that for women, being married to men who are also revolutionaries, they're going to have children who need to be educated. Their education should be both religious to make sure that they're religiously pure, but also they should be taught the ideas of the Enlightenment and virtue and citizenship, and that they should be doing all that they can to support the revolutionary efforts, whether it's boycotts or patriotic support, to throw themselves behind the idea of being good Americans. And so that's a philosophy that weaves through this time period of what a good woman will be doing when she's helping out with the war effort itself. Let me see here. The next question I have is about the Great Compromise. And the Great Compromise, if you remember, was the idea that we had. And I've got a question here that's asking about the Virginia and New Jersey plans. And so if you remember, under the Articles of Confederation, they had what we call, and let me see if I can get that, a unicameral legislature, which means a one-house legislature. And no matter how many people you sent to the legislature from your state, you only get one vote. Now, when that went away, there was an idea of possibly going with a different style of legislature then, and one plan was the New Jersey plan. And the New Jersey plan is going to be identical to this, where we're going to have equal representation in a one-house legislature. So they're very much trying to hold on to what they were doing previously. They're willing to go beyond one vote per state, but they want each state to be equal. The Virginia plan, though, was the idea of creating what we call a bicameral legislature, which means a two-house legislature. And if you remember, for both of those two legislatures, they were going to be based on population size rather than having equal representation like we have here. So what the Virginia plan is going to do, and the New Jersey plan, they're going to be plans for both big states and small states. And what Madison comes up with is what's known as the Great Compromise. We're going to have two legislatures, so we're going to go bicameral, but we're going to have one legislature that has equal representation. This is our Senate. And then we're going to have one based on population. That's our House of Representatives. And then the determination was that in order to figure out what bills go to the president, they need to pass both houses with identical language. Otherwise, they're not allowed to go to the president. And so that's what's known as our Great Compromise. And then if you remember, that population-based legislature over here, House of Representatives, that's part of our 3/5 compromise, where they figure out a solution to try to figure out how to count African slaves in order to keep the South happy. Now, they're rigging the representation towards the South in the House, but it's determined that if they don't, then the South is not going to join with the Constitution. So that's the reason why compromises are woven throughout the Constitution, because without them, this thing's not getting signed. Let me see here. The next question is, who was Patrick Henry? He is a Virginia revolutionary who is very suspicious of the Federalists and the Constitution. He wants to maintain a weaker central government. So he's one of the people who, along with the Anti-Federalists, are working against the Constitution at first, and then for the addition of a Bill of Rights to protect people's rights in language that's written into the Constitution that can't be misunderstood. The next question I have here is the XYZ affair, and I believe we already covered that, so I think we should be good. We've covered the Virginia plans. The next question I see is about the Electoral College. The Electoral College is one of many different elements inside the Constitution that is meant to create a layer of oversight to prevent the mob from making bad decisions when it comes to elections. And so what we talked about when it came to elections was we talked about the idea that inside any state elections, you're going to have what's called the popular vote. Popular vote is going to be when people are voting. They're going to have, though, inside of each state, a group of people who are going to be part of what's called the Electoral College. Each state gets electors based on how many senators plus representatives they have. And so let's say in this case, like we talked about in our example in class, let's say that we have a Democratic win in the state of Minnesota. Minnesota has 2 senators plus 8 representatives. And so during the summertime prior to the election, the Democrats and the Republicans will choose their electors from people who are loyal members of their party. So as you can see here, we got 10 electors for the Democrats, 10 for the Republicans. But because the Democrats won the election, their electors then are going to be the ones who officially vote in our presidential election in December when it comes time to choosing the president. These guys are going to go home. They're going to not have any reason to be there because in our state, We have a winner-take-all system for our electoral college. That's different in 2 states, Nebraska and Maine. We're not worried about that. That's a U.S. government question that's going to be that you'll have to deal with eventually. This will help us understand the electoral college to the point where when the vote then takes place for our president, it's our 10 electors who will all be going to choose who our presidential pick will be. So in our state, it will be unanimous as long as the electors vote the way that they should. Key thing to understand, this, along with the fact that during the Constitution, we're not allowed to directly vote for our senators. And in the House of Representatives, there's all sorts of requirements before you can actually vote in those races. There's a bunch of layers that are built up during our early constitutional process by Federalists who are very nervous that we've got a group of people inside the United States who are not education or class-wise built to engage in democracy. And so we've got a very much more limited democracy during the early time of our history than most people actually realize. We also, though, have a much more representative democracy than virtually any place else in the world at that point. So while it's limited by our standards, by their standards, it's pretty revolutionary. So hopefully that helps with the Electoral College. The Boston Ratifying Convention, I am assuming that what you're referring to is the process that was used to adopt the Massachusetts state constitution. And what they were doing was they used that as an example for how we should ratify our United States Constitution by, instead of sending it to the legislatures, we're going to have the people themselves approve the Constitution in a statewide vote. And the reason why they're doing that is because they very much do not want to have the legislatures getting their hands involved on a process that might be taking away power from them, because then they would reject that if we were trying to tweak the way that their government was working. The ratification process that Massachusetts used is going to be the process then that we use inside the United States, where we're going to have a constitutional convention in the government to try to create our Constitution itself. And then they're going to send that out to the 13 states and let the states themselves vote on it rather than letting the legislatures make their decisions. It's also the reason why the Constitution starts off with the statement, "We the people," rather than "we the legislatures," for exactly that purpose. The next question I see, who was involved in the Battle of Fallen Timbers and the Treaty of Greenville? This is going to be taking place between Native Americans who are getting support from the British, and they're in the Ohio River Valley. And they're battling against a man named Mad Anthony Wayne, who is a general for the United States military forces, who is moving into the Ohio River Valley to fight against the Native Americans. In that battle, then, they're able to defeat the Native Americans, and in the Treaty of Greenville, they're able to move them further back away from settlements that are moving past the Appalachian Mountains through the Cumberland Gap. Let me see here. The next question. Can I explain the Convention of 1800? And I'm not certain. I want to take 2 stabs at this to make sure that I'm getting this right, because we've got both the French who are being discussed during that time period. And so let me check out to see which one is being referred to. I apologize, you guys getting to stare at me while I'm reading here. Okay, so, Convention of 1800. The confusion I had was I didn't know if we were talking about the Jefferson election or the one that was dealing with Paris. And so when you take a look at what's going on with the deal in the Convention of 1800, it is a meeting that's taking place where John Adams had problems with the French in the XYZ affair. It led to a buildup of the military, attention about wars. John Adams, though, it gets all sorts of negative attention, rightly so, for like the Alien and Sedition Acts and the overreaction for the XYZ affair. He also gets tons of credit, though, for diffusing the military paranoia, because instead of following Hamilton's advice to go to war, where he wanted to use the military to crush Jefferson and Madison and the Democratic Republicans, Adams sent another set of ambassadors over to France, and they discovered a country that had just gone through another power shift. And so in the Convention of 1800, they're able to figure out a peace treaty where the XYZ affair is forgotten. They're able to figure out some solutions to how they're going to get along with each other. And as a result, we don't need a war, and the paranoia drifts away. And when we elect Jefferson and we don't have a bloodbath of cutting off people's heads, we don't then need to be worried about a military invasion by the French during that time, which allows everybody to calm down. And so for Adams, while he had some missteps with the Alien and Sedition Acts, that was very much a high point for him, where he was able to keep us from going to an unnecessary war with the French that was mainly being brought forward by hysteria. So let me take a look. That's period 2, and I'll check to see if we've got any new posts for that class period. I see nothing. So period 4's questions. Got a question about mobocracy. Mobocracy is strictly the idea that there are elites inside the country, like the Hamiltons and the Adamses and the Washingtons and so on, who are very frightened that if the mob is in control, they're fearful that that government that's created by them is going to be not governed by philosophical principles or ideals, but just by passion. And what they're afraid of is they watch what's going on with like the French and how they're cutting off people's heads. And as they topple, a new government comes into power and they topple the old government, they just slaughter everybody. And for these individuals, that doesn't feel like what the Enlightenment was about. It feels like what people with very little intelligence but a lot of passion would be doing. And so we see a lot from the Founding Fathers about how they're trying to figure out ways to be free, but also prevent those passions from getting out of control that could then lead to some pretty rash decisions. Let me see here. We've already talked about Society of Cincinnatus. Blake, you've got a question about common laws. Simply put, when you think about common law, those are just the decisions that have been made by the courts and legislatures all throughout time that have built up precedents, which means examples of how the law should be interpreted that future generations should embrace. What they were trying to point out at that part of the textbook is that for the British, their constitution was made up of their common laws. So each time they added a new law, their constitution just got bigger. And what the Founding Fathers were looking to create was more like the charters they had when they started colonies, that they would have explicitly written out very simply the foundational rules for how they would be living. Understand they might add other laws in, but always making sure that they would check back to make sure they weren't violating any of the foundational constitutional principles that they laid out at the beginning. They wanted those laws also to be very hard to change rather than being very easy to change, and they thought that would then rein in dictators in the future. Let me see here. The next question asks about the Reign of Terror, and the Reign of Terror was simply what was taking place in France, where once their revolution got started, the leaders who kept taking control would fire up the hysteria of the mob inside of France, and then you'd have these civil wars where one side would topple the other side and then cut off all their heads, leading to a bloodbath, and that became known as the Reign of Terror. Let me see here. The next question is about the Whiskey Rebellion. Whiskey Rebellion is very simple from the standpoint that Alexander Hamilton needs money to pay off the debts that he has now gathered together through funding and assumption. He's decided to create tariffs, which are taxes on foreign goods. So we create like a tax force field around the country to make foreign goods more expensive. And that more expensive price is being done by a tax that's then paid to the United States government. The Whiskey Rebellion, though, is about what's called an excise tax, where they're putting a tax on specific products. And the product that they're taxing here is whiskey, and that's making farmers in western Pennsylvania and other places really mad because they are making a lot of whiskey, largely because they're too far from the coast to transport their grain without it rotting. But they're then feeling persecuted because they're not all that wealthy, but they're now being singled out to pay off these taxes, to pay these taxes for our debts, even though they're still owed money for their debts from the Revolutionary War. And so they stage a rebellion, kind of like Shays' Rebellion, which we just talked about a little bit ago, where they rebel. But instead of backing down or creating a new government like we did after Shays' Rebellion, George Washington put together a massive army, which he and Hamilton led into Pennsylvania, to use the example that rebellion now is not tolerated. It's something that was okay during the Revolution when we had taxation without representation, but now these guys have representation, and so they can't rebel whenever they want to. Let me see here. We've already covered the Land Ordinance and the Northwest Ordinance. With the Old Northwest, that was the area that was covered by the Northwest Ordinance, and the Americans want to fill that up quickly because that's territory that's still ringed by the British and their Native American allies, so the quicker they fill it, the quicker it becomes securely American and that can't be taken away. What do we need to know about the Constitutional Convention? The compromises are key, and especially the battles between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, where the Federalists are arguing through their Federalist Papers, and the Anti-Federalists eventually will demand the Bill of Rights in order to get their satisfaction and their passage of the Constitution. Let me see here. The next question is about the Neutrality Proclamation. And this was George Washington's recognition that as a country, we weren't strong enough either economically or else militarily to really get involved in a competition with Europe. And so his advice was to try to maintain neutrality for the time being until we could achieve a level of military strength that we could then compete with the British and the French and the Spanish. And so in particular, he very much advised against getting into European land wars that were always known for their shifting alliances, where you might have a country that was against another country for a while, and then they might form an alliance because it made a better sense politically for them. Washington advised us to stay out of all that stuff if possible, and allow ourselves to be protected by the Atlantic Ocean and the distance from Europe. And you're going to see that's going to be a legacy that carries us all the way up until World War I, where we're still looking to his advice for that. Let me see here. We've already talked about Jefferson's Kentucky Resolution. I see Jay's Treaty here. Jay's Treaty is a treaty that's created by John Jay with the British, and it's a great example of Washington's desire for neutrality. John Jay was sent from his role as Supreme Court Chief Justice to England to negotiate, and his efforts were hampered because Alexander Hamilton let the British know that we really didn't need anything to be satisfied by the British, and so we got virtually nothing in return for giving the British quite a few concessions that made the British very happy. In Hamilton's mind, it was great to be friends with the British rather than being their enemies, so that hopefully we could trade with them and have the British Navy's protection. But when this treaty was created, it was the first time that George Washington really received a lot of criticism, especially from farmers and the Democratic Republicans in particular, who felt like he had betrayed America by giving a sweetheart deal to England and not holding out, especially since we'd fought them during the Revolution. And so that's going to be a dividing point, although what George Washington will tell the Americans is, I don't like being criticized. You either will support the treaty or else you're criticizing me and attacking me by attacking the treaty. And so the treaty got passed, even though many Americans weren't big fans of that. You will find, though, that shortly after that treaty, we have what's known as Pinckney's Treaty, or the Treaty of San Lorenzo, where Spain got really confused about Jay's treaty, and they saw America now becoming really tight with Britain. And so they volunteered to open up the Mississippi River, allow our boats through, which they didn't allow during the Articles. And they also gave us a chunk of Florida strictly because they were afraid that England and an American alliance could possibly then topple the Spanish Empire and take all their colonies away from them. And it's this signal of weakness by the Spanish that's going to lead to them gradually losing territory over the next few decades, because the Americans become more and more emboldened by the idea that perhaps the Spanish don't have a strong grip over the colonies like they pretend they do. Let me see here. We've covered the Alien and Sedition Acts, and so hopefully those are good for you guys. Let me see here. The impact of Jay's Treaty, I think we're good with as well. Can you describe the difference between a democracy and a republic? You can have a democracy and not be a republic. Many republics will use democracy as their way of selecting their leaders. And so the way that a republic works is it's a philosophy on how government should be working, with an emphasis on the idea of a balancing of power between the central government and the states, and with the idea that the only reason why a government is created is to protect the rights of the people. And so you are currently in a republic right now where you don't directly vote on every issue, so you don't have a direct democracy, but you do get a chance to democratically elect the representatives that you have, who are going to then embody those principles in their behaviors, or else you can vote them out of office. You can have a democracy that is not Republican in nature, and many governments have held elections, but then afterwards not held the principles that are held by a republic, and instead have been dictatorships or other sorts of governments instead. And so that's the difference. As far as that being a huge element of our course, though, it's not going to be much that we spend a lot more time debating, but you will see it pop up again in your government class when you take it in 12th grade. We've already covered the Society of Cincinnati. The 9th and the 10th Amendments were two that we focused on in class, and the question is, can I differentiate the 9th and the 10th Amendments for you guys? They're both related to each other, and they're both incredibly important for the Anti-Federalists as kind of a catch-all for any other rights that weren't covered in the first 8 amendments. So the first 8 amendments are very specific about freedom of speech, religion, rights that you have during court trials, and so on. The 9th Amendment, though, says that there are a whole bunch of rights that we can't write down in detail in the Constitution, but it's understood that even though it's not written down specifically, you have many other rights that are also protected by the Constitution from government takeover that aren't being written here. That vagueness, though, is going to make it very hard to determine how far does that go, and you'll see that playing out as a battle throughout our course. The 10th Amendment, though, is the one that we're going to see playing out quite a bit in our battle over the Civil War and going forward even to today. And in the 10th Amendment, the argument is made that anything that is not written specifically into the Constitution as a right or a power of the United States government then belongs to the states or the people and should not be taken by the United States government. The problem with that, though, is what we saw in Article Number 1, where we learned about the elastic clause or the necessary and proper clause, where it's already in the Constitution by that point that it can be implied that the government has certain rights and powers to create things that aren't explicitly described in the Constitution to fulfill their roles that they have inside the country. And so you have a dilemma, because the 10th Amendment is trying to prohibit the government from taking on all sorts of powers that aren't written in the Constitution, but with the elastic clause, there's really not a lot of guidance as far as how far you can stretch that clause. And you're going to find that that's the eternal battle we're going to have throughout our course and politics, where conservatives nowadays will argue that the 10th Amendment strictly limits the Constitution. And many times when they make that argument, they will pretend that like the elastic clause isn't there, or that it's much more limited than what a liberal will notice, where a liberal will argue that with the elastic clause, it's nice that you got the 10th Amendment, but there's a very small number of things that could be considered then unconstitutional for the United States government to be doing. And that's again the crux of what we're going to see throughout our course, is that battle between liberals and conservatives and which they want to spend more time emphasizing. Let me see here. Can I explain how the national debt was actually a blessing in Hamilton's eyes? Definitely. Hamilton's problem was that with the Articles, we acted like 13 independent countries. That's great for independence and freedom. The dilemma with that, though, is that if you have no unity, you can't then get anything done. And so for Hamilton, his belief was that if he absorbed all the debts from the American Revolution, and if you think about that debt, nobody could really argue that that was a bad thing because everybody was enjoying their independence. But by gathering that all together, he could point out, we as a country will then get the benefit of paying off our national debt, because it will help satisfy the French, it'll help satisfy our citizens, and if we pay back our debt over time, the French will then become closer with us strictly because they like those payments coming in. But his argument then that this then justified taxation was something that Anti-Federalists did not like one bit. People who loved the Articles loved the idea of not allowing the federal government to charge taxes. And people whose states didn't have debts were really angry that they were now having to pay taxes to pay for other states whose debts weren't satisfied yet. But for Hamilton, the idea was, by having this one common goal that all the states were then working towards, it created cohesion and also a justification for taxation, which did pay down our debts, but it also helped us to fund a military, to fill the Bank of the United States, to be able to start funding other projects. So he saw the positives because that allowed the money flow to start coming in, to start paying for these things that we needed to do as a country. You're going to see during other times like the Civil War, World War I, World War II, those moments of united national purpose then allows the federal government to rally everybody behind that central government. And you'll see a lot being accomplished, but you'll also see the government get stronger, which is what made a lot of anti-federalists or Democratic Republicans later really mad, especially with the creation of the Bank of the United States, which they argued was unconstitutional. Let me see here. Once the Neutrality Proclamation was in action, did the Franco-American alliance stop? Technically, our alliance ended at the end of the American Revolution. For the textbook, you know, it's the Convention of 1800 where we're finally resolving things with the French to end the XYZ affair. But technically, once the war is done and we signed the Treaty of Paris with Britain, we kind of leave the French out in the cold, and they don't get a lot for being allies with us, and that makes them very frustrated. Let me see here. Why did Hamilton sabotage Jay's treaty? Hamilton's trying to figure out how to trade with the British, become friends with them, get on the same side as the British Navy. And his feeling was, we don't need to be enemies with the British anymore. We've gained our independence. If we can now become their trading partners and work with them, he felt like we had a language and religion and political ideology that was far better aligned with the British. He was somebody who looked at the French with their language differences, cultural differences, and religious differences, and he was very suspicious about all elements of French society. So if he could figure out ways to mend fences with the British, get them to not be our enemies anymore, and start trading with them, that would help our economy recover quite quickly, especially since we'd already had trade relationships with them that have been just fractured because of the war and our exclusion now from the Navigation Acts. So let me take a look. I'm now done with period 4. Let me take a look at period 6. We've discussed what an excise tax is, so hopefully the first question that I see right here is helped out by that, a specific tax on a certain product that is going to help create revenue for the government. The next question I see from Celia is a question about the written constitution being drafted by a convention and ratified by the direct vote of the people. They did not want to go through the state legislatures to clarify what's going on with the guidebook. They wanted to avoid going to the legislatures because when they rewrote the Constitution, from the articles, they were about to take a bunch of power away from the state legislatures, and they were afraid if they sent this Constitution to the state legislatures, they would kill it because they were afraid they were going to lose their power. Let me see here. We've already discussed the sedition and alien law, so hopefully that's good. Brooke, you've got a question about the compact theory, and the question that she has is, what is the compact theory and what does that have with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions? That's a really good question. And so the way to think about it is with John Locke and the other Enlightenment philosophers, they argued that when a government is created, a compact or an agreement is made between the citizens and the government. So a trade is taking place. Like you and I have certain abilities where if we wanted to, we could be violent or criminal in ways that would be terrible. You know, you can go on a crime spree where you're murdering or stealing or whatever. The compact theory is that we all voluntarily give up some of those freedoms or powers that we have that would be antisocial. And the idea is that by giving up those freedoms, we are making a deal with the government that they will also enforce rules or laws so that nobody else is able to do those things to us. So if we're not murdering people, we won't also be murdered. And the deal is that with the compact theory, the only reason why the government's around is to protect your basic human rights, life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness, so that then you can engage in a civil society. And once that compact is broken, once the government stops protecting your rights, in this case, what Jefferson and Madison are saying is the Alien and Sedition Acts are taking away people's rights, then the government shouldn't exist anymore because that's the only reason why it should exist. So hopefully that helps out with the compact theory. Let me see here. In Chapter 10, the book stops talking about anti-federalists and starts talking about Democratic Republicans. Great question. So here is the best way to picture Federalists and anti-federalists. So with your Federalists, they are the people who want the Constitution. The thing that's going to be confusing about them, and I'm going to put down just two people, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, and these guys will serve as our point for what's going on with these guys. The Federalists want the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists are afraid of the Constitution. As we've discussed, they lose, but the Anti-Federalists will get a Bill of Rights added to the Constitution. So imagine this being like a pickup game of basketball where at the end of the game, they're done. And the teams are over. And at this point, the Federalists win. They create a Constitution. But when we create our first government, George Washington argues that we should not have political parties anymore. And he announces that he's going to be party free. He's just an American, not a Federalist or anything else. What we're going to find, though, that in spite of what Washington wants to do, we're going to have Alexander Hamilton still be a Federalist. He's going to maintain that same name because that's a patriotic name that he can use to describe his party. The Federalists are going to become Hamilton and John Adams, and that's going to become notable for them because you're going to end up with a group called the Democratic Republicans. And the Democratic Republicans are going to be very much bothered by what's going on with the interpretation of the Constitution, where under the Federalists, they've got a loose interpretation of the Constitution. They're using the elastic clause to try to stretch the Constitution to cover things like the Bank of the United States and funding and assumption. And so what we want to notice is that the anti-federalists who are here oftentimes become Democratic Republicans. These are people who, when they agreed to the Constitution, they didn't want a loose interpretation of the Constitution. They said that this Constitution is already going too far, but if we're going to have it, we want to strictly interpret the Constitution so they're only allowed to do what they're allowed to do. And the 9th and 10th Amendment are meant to keep it from getting too big. And so when you look at the Federalists, James Madison was one of our first Federalists. He's writing the Federalist Papers. He's the father of the Constitution. When we create our parties, though, he and Jefferson are going to become our Democratic Republicans, representing farmers, strict interpretation of the Constitution, and they're going to hate what Hamilton is up to by stretching the Constitution so much. So hopefully that explains what's going on with their parties. Let me see here. After the Neutrality Proclamation was dropped, Jeffersonians were mad because they want to support the French, but the textbook also says that Thomas Jefferson supported Washington's choice to remain neutral. So the dilemma that Jefferson was facing was he wanted to help out the French. His problem, though, was as Secretary of State, we didn't have the military to be able to help out in a substantial way. We also didn't have the financing to be able to pull that off. And what Washington pointed out was the idea that with the government constantly churning over, it was tricky. By the time we mobilized an offensive to actually step into France, they were changing power so often and cutting off people's heads that it was really hard to figure out who to support. And so what they were waiting for was some sort of clarification as far as what the situation was over in France. And so throughout the rest of Washington's presidency, that's kind of where Jefferson's stuck, is he really doesn't have a way to move forward, even though he's troubled by the fact that we're not helping out the French. And then towards the end of Washington's presidency, Jefferson's going to step down as Secretary of State so he can run for president against John Adams, where those ideas are still percolating about what should we do with the French and the British and their situations. So let me go back and see if there's any other questions that have now popped up. Period 5, we look good. Looks like period 2, we're all done. Period 4 looks like it's finished as well. And I don't see anything new with period 6. So hopefully you're good. I'm very happy to see you guys tomorrow. Hopefully you've had a relaxing and good break. You've earned it. And keep in mind, you're now done with Chapter 10. That is 1/4 of the way through our textbook. We have covered a lot of ground in a very short amount of time, in a month and a half. And I'm very impressed by the work that you're putting forward. So I hope you do great tomorrow. Keep positive with the test tomorrow. Hopefully you see good results. And if you find that you struggle, remember, I would love to help you out in any way, so feel free to let me know if you're still having struggles or concerns as we transition into Chapter 11. Remember, also, tomorrow is your Chapter 9 and 10 test. Tuesday is your first President's test, Presidents 1 through 45. Memorizing their last names, unless they share a last name with somebody else, then you'll need to know their full name when you're filling them out. But also remember, you've got 3 opportunities to take that test, so if the first one doesn't go well, feel free to study for the next one, and you should be good. Again, thanks for joining me tonight. I appreciate it, and hopefully this has helped out. I will see you tomorrow. Have a good night.